Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people here tonight. Welcome. I'm Susan Call. I'm the events advisor here at Politics and Prose. And on behalf of our owners and our staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Just a couple things before we get started. Please remember to silence your cell phones. And during our Q&A, we have a microphone right here. If you don't mind stepping up, we're recording this event. And also take a look on our website at all of the great events and programs and trips that we have coming up the rest of the year. What is that noise? Is that? Oh, that's downstairs. Sorry about that. There's some work being done downstairs. Yeah, so I am very excited to introduce Paula Whyman tonight. Paula's a friend whose work I've been reading and admiring for a couple of decades now, including her beautiful short story collection, You May See a Stranger, which we had an event for that here when it launched. And tonight she's here to talk about her new book, Bad Naturalist, which is about her efforts to restore 200 acres of farmland that had long gone to seed in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And it's full of Paula's trademark dry humor and always engaging voice. And it's also educational, especially for those of us who don't spend as much time as we should thinking about ecology. I read this book months ago, and I'm still thinking about it and even having occasional bad dreams about being strangled by vineweed. So the book's just out last week and getting great reviews. Publishers Weekly has called her book charming and enchanting and compared it favorably to Isabella Tree's Wilding, which is high praise for anyone familiar with that book. Paula will be in conversation tonight with Washington Post's Dana Milbank. You probably know Dana for his work as a nationally syndicated op-ed columnist with the Washington Post and as a New York Times bestselling author, or you know him for his political commentary on MSNBC and CNN and various other outlets. But you might not know that he too is a recent transplant to rural Virginia, and he's chronicled some of his own experiences that are similar to Paula's about trying to protect his land from invasive species. So before we turn it over, one more note tonight. Under a couple of chairs, I see one of them is actually vacant, so somebody can look at the chair next to them. There should be a Post-it note underneath, and if you have a Post-it note at the end of the event, bring it up and you will get a tote bag. So on that note, please help me welcome Paula Whyman and Dana Milbank.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Susan. Good to see a lot of folks out here tonight. And I'm very happy to be here with Paula, who has written a fabulous book about a subject near and dear to my heart. I think the bug bit you a couple of years before it bit me, but when it bites you, it's almost like Lyme disease. You can't really get rid of it. In fact, I was remarking to Paula, as soon as this is over, I've got to drive out to the mountains because I've got to light a fire in the morning. Because you got to hurry up and do it before the snow melts. Otherwise, you know, the whole county is going to look like Los Angeles the way with my skills. But I took some inspiration from reading this book, and look forward to discussing it all with you. I think you're actually quite a good naturalist from what I've read. You know, the truth is, as I've gone down this whole adventure, I find that the people who really like know everything are the most modest about their abilities. So I think that the sign of somebody who's actually a good naturalist would be one who would call themselves a bad naturalist. I'd like, maybe you could start off by giving us kind of an overview. I think, as you put it when we were having a conversation earlier, how you got into this mess. And that's, which captures the self-deprecating nature of what you've done. So give us sort of the backstory, and then we'll go through more of the pieces of it.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So decades ago, my husband Bill and I started trying to follow a dream of looking for farmland in the country. And we weren't sure, we just wanted like a little small piece of land, a little small farmhouse. And I thought, I'll raise some sheep, I'll plant a vegetable garden, Bill will hike and, fish, whatever. So this went on for a while, and we never really followed through with it. And then once our kids were off adulting several years ago, we decided to start looking in earnest. And at the time, I'd also been reading a lot about the importance of native plants. And I'd read Isabella Trees Wilding, which is about her efforts to return her 3,000 plus acre farm in England to nature. And I'd been reading Doug Tallamy's Nature's Best Hope and learning about his homegrown national park movement to bring native plants back and replace lawns with native plants in the suburbs. So I had this all in my head, and I thought, wherever we end up, I'm going to plant a small native meadow and do my part for native birds and bees and wildlife and so on that will help by this. And when I thought small, I thought maybe an acre or two, which in farmland standards is pretty small, but that was what I had in mind. And I thought, I'm going to have this meadow, and I'm going to put my writing shed in the middle of it, and the flowers are going to grow all around me. I'm going to watch the birds and the bees. I'm going to write my book, and it's going to be so romantic. And I was delusional, right? So one day we were out looking, and we were looking, like I said, for a farmhouse, and someone told us, you have to see the view on top of this mountain. It's really incredible. You have to see this view. We're like, okay, well, while we're out here, we'll just go up and see this view just for fun. For fun, it was the middle of August. You know what August is like. It's hot. The sun was bright. The mountain, we had to climb, we had to walk up over a mile up this steep, not road. It was not a road. It was rocks and roots. It was a trail. We had to walk up to the top. And when we got up to this open meadow, this had been a cattle farm for decades, but it had also been nothing for several years. It had been disused, and the plants had just grown up. They were all over our heads. So we're walking through this little narrow path that had mowed between all of these plants, kind of like a jungle. And we got up to the top, and I was surrounded by these 6-foot plus tall yellow flowers everywhere. The bees were buzzing around me. It just felt like this really overwhelming natural environment. And I looked out from this high point over the meadow, acres and acres of rolling hills and steep slopes with these yellow flowers as far as I could see. And I thought about my idea, my plan to plant this small meadow, and it seemed very like a very small, unambitious plan. And in that moment, I thought, wow, I could really do something with this place. This could be really incredible. This is what I later learned was 75 acres of open meadow on top of a mountain, which is very unusual in the East. And I thought, well, I could really do something here, totally disregarding the fact that I didn't really know anything about plants. I knew a lot about nature. I was passionate about nature all my life, but I didn't really know. I was a terrible gardener. I couldn't identify plants. I had no idea where to start with this, but I was going to do it anyway. So that's what happened, for better or worse.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just happen into it in some sort of an accidental way. I had this. I wondered about this while reading the book. So I would like it if you could assess, what you would say your success level is, and also like what's the end game? Like what is, because I'm out there working all the time and cursing, and it seems, as you've described, one step forward and two steps back. So what is the ultimate goal? Like how do you define success, and how far along that process are you?
That's a great question. I've been working on this for almost 4 years, and I would say that success will be when the proportion of native plants exceeds the proportion of non-native and invasive plants. I mean, ultimately, my goal is to have 80% native plants. That is probably not realistic because this is a place that was a cattle pasture, as I mentioned. So there are all these hay grasses, pasture grasses. Before that, it was an orchard for 150 years, an apple orchard. So there's also orchard grasses. There's also a concentration of native plants that are just there. And there are also a bunch of invasive plants that have been brought in. Some were planted intentionally, unknowingly. Some weren't, just brought in by accident. And it's really the invasive plants that are the big problem, and I spend 80% of my time probably dealing with that. So what is the end game? I don't think there is an end game. It's an endless game.
Right. I think people, we've worked with some of the same experts out there, and they say, well, it's a 5-year process. I was like, well, no, it's not. I can already see that. It's 5 years till you, in theory, get some measure of control over it, and then you maintain it. But there's no way I'm going to have control over it in 5 years. So how long ago was it that the cattle were grazing up there? Because I it's probably worth explaining that they were probably keeping the invasives as well as the good stuff in check by eating it, which is keeping things from growing, good as well as bad, from growing there. And so so how long ago was that? And let's like sort of tease out. I don't want to give out too much away unless you've all bought your book already. But the various monsters, and which one do you think? You write about the ailanthus. You write about the mile a minute. Several others in there, I think, but autumn olive, right? I deal with all these. Bittersweet is the real monster that I'm dealing with, and then there's Japanese stilt grass and a million other things. And then, of course, you find that you slay one monster, like, was it ailanthus, and then you wind up with a whole acres and acres of mile a minute. So let's talk about both that the timing, like how long had this field been the way it is, and then what are your various monsters and how are you slaying them?
That's a great question. I think when the restoration ecologists and the contractors tell you it's a 5-year process, they're just saying, okay, I'm going to have an income for 5 years. I can count on that. So this has been a cattle farm since sometime in the 1970s. And before that, it was an orchard from the 1830s on. So all over Rappahannock County, this is Rappahannock County in Virginia, which is the northern Blue Ridge, not far from Shenandoah National Park. The whole county and really a lot of the Piedmont in Virginia was apple orchards. And part of the reason they liked to plant apples on mountains was because they were above the freeze line. So the trees would be protected in a freeze. And it was quite a successful industry there for a long time, but then New York and Washington states became dominant in the apple market, and all of the apple orchards, or many of them, turned to cattle. And cattle is a very different thing, but of course, every time you change the land through some kind of agriculture or development, you also change the soil, you change the plants, and going from meadow and forest to first to orchards, you would take out the whole forest understory or the whole grassland to plant those trees. And then when you take out those apple trees to make it into pasture, then you're taking out, whatever was there that was growing under the trees and so on. And I happen to know they bulldozed all the apple trees In the 70s, they left one.
All right, and so and now what's come up in
what's
its
come up?
place?
Okay, okay.
And how do you rate this parade of horribles?
All right, so in the late 1700s, in the exotic plant trade that started in Philadelphia, there was a big trend toward importing all of these exotic plants, and wealthy people would do it, and many of our founding fathers, and those plants would first be traded among different botanical gardens around the world, and then they'd eventually make their way to, residential gardens and so on. And sometimes it took a long time for them to get out of the garden, but eventually a lot of them escaped. And one of those was the tree of heaven. And that was my first nemesis on the mountain. And if you drive down River Road, say, you'll see a lot of them. They look exotic. They don't look like our area's deciduous trees. They have sort of palm-like branches. They slightly resemble black walnut trees a little bit, but they definitely look sort of out of place. I don't know how else to explain it. And once I can identify an invasive plant, once I knew what they looked like, I started seeing them everywhere, and I couldn't not see them. It was just so frustrating to me. And finally, there's a school near where we live, and every time I passed this school, I would see they had these beautiful grounds, but they had these big tree of heaven or ailanthus trees on this corner that I would pass all the time. And finally, I just called them, and I asked to speak to the the landscape people, because they take great pride in their landscape at the school. And I explained all about the problems of the tree of heaven and how it had all these different ways of reproducing, and how it would secrete toxins into the soil that would prevent other plants from growing around it, and eventually it would push out the native trees and native plants, and eliminate or reduce the amount of food that was available for birds, insects, bees, and so on. And they were like, huh.
Thanks.
Yeah, we'll do something about that. I mean, they really genuinely seem to want to do something about it. But of course, that was like 2 years ago, and I'm still driving past that cluster of trees. So,
Yeah, they're awful. I mean, because if
Yeah.
you just cut them down, they'll come back 100 times
yes,
more
you
potent.
can't just cut them down. That's another thing that I was like really surprised to learn, that if something is invasive, you can't just cut it. You have to immediately treat it with some kind of noxious chemical, and you have to do it at exactly the right time of year, and you have to do it exactly the right way, or it will know what you're doing somehow. And like the tree of heaven will send out shoots as much as 50 feet away. I found them when we had mowed one of our meadow fields, and I was walking because suddenly I could see everything. You can imagine the field gets, this high, and when we mow it down to like 8 inches once a year or so, you can suddenly see more of the landscape. So I was taking a walk, and I literally tripped over this cut sapling, and I looked ahead of me, and there was a whole row of them, like 3 feet, spaced 3 feet apart. And I said, I know no one planted a row of trees here, so how did this even happen? And eventually, a conservation biologist walked me over to this place 50 feet away in the meadow, where there was a gigantic tree of heaven, and like 24 baby trees that had shot up from its roots that all were about 15 feet tall, and said, you need to get rid of this. and that is what led to that row of saplings in that field.
And they smell bad,
Oh, they
and then
smell
they
so
attract
bad.
this spotted lanternfly,
They
which
attract.
is another invasive pest.
Yes, they are the host tree for the spotted lanternfly. So it's good reason to get rid of it. I also, at one time, called the Montgomery County parks. I couldn't figure out who would handle, I called the highway, the road people. I was trying to figure out who takes care of the trees along the road to try to impress on them that it was very important to get rid of the tree of heaven that, where it was along our roads, or they were going to have spotted lanternflies. Their solution, I believe, what I heard was they were going to spray the insects rather than killing the trees, which,
Yeah.
wouldn't really do the job.
Right. What would you say was or has been your lowest point? And was there a moment at which you said, I shouldn't have done this? Like, I want out. Like you wanted to get in the car and drive back.
How many days a week? Yeah, well, I guess that would have been, there was a thicket of invasive bushes that get to be, they call them shrubs, but they can be like 20 feet tall and 20 feet wide, and they're dense, and if you try to cut them, they actually get stronger and harder to cut. They grow back stronger. So I had this thicket in this one, a few acres of field, and these particular bushes had been planted in Virginia on purpose by the Department of Forestry some many years ago. The autumn olive is what I'm talking about. Yeah, as a erosion control and a windbreak, because that's another way that invasive plants got around, as they were planted on purpose with good intentions. So I was trying to get rid of this thicket, and I had all these ideas about what to do. And finally, the man who does our bush hogging, which is kind of like a mowing on steroids. If you have big, big, tall, dense stuff, you need a tractor with a big attachment on it to actually cut it. And he was like, I can get rid of those for you. I'm like, really? No, really, they'll be gone if I get rid of them. So he did something that was even more than bush hogging, which is called forestry mulching, which is basically you can cut anything with this thing and it's like pulverized. And I said, okay, but I was really concerned that if he left the roots, it would grow back. Well, he didn't leave the roots. There was nothing left. There was nothing. It looked like a wasteland. I was really worried about that, because anytime you disturb land, you're making room for more invasive plants. You don't know what to come in. But luckily, what happened was a few weeks later, native plants started to grow. I started to see all these native plants: milkweed, elderberry, tick trefoil, all kinds of beautiful native plants were coming up. And I was really happy. Weeks went by, I was watching them grow. And I was like, great, this is done. I can go do something else. So I went to the other end of the property where I was pulling 3-foot tall stilk grass. So that, then a few weeks later, I came back to gloat over these acres of native plants and found instead a horrible invasive vine that grows 6 inches a day had taken over the entire field. And I guess, yes, that's the mile-a-minute vine.
Yes, and it has little stickers that, what do they call it, thumbprick or something?
Yeah, it has thorns all over it, and it's pretty obnoxious.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those are pretty.
That was a low
pretty
point.
bad.
See,
I was pretty sure you were going to say rattlesnakes.
Oh,
Now, can we talk about that without giving away too much from the book?
I guess, yeah, we can talk about the rattlesnakes.
Because that would be enough to. I mean, I've had 8-foot black rat snakes at my place, and they would bite you, I suppose, but they're pretty shy and they're not venomous.
They're good,
but they have
eat
been
rodents
in my house, which I don't appreciate.
Yeah.
In fact, I plugged. There were lots of snakes before. The house was wide open, but before I got there. But then we plugged everything, put in new windows, did everything else. I had a friend was over, a weekend guest, and he gets out of the shower, and I hear him call, "Dana, is this your idea of a joke?" So he saw this coiled up 8-foot-long snake, and he thought it was rubber, and I'd put it outside the bathroom door, which would have been a good joke, right? But and he threw his boxers at it, and it moved. For all that, it was still in the house, but at least it wasn't a rattlesnake. So
yeah.
Tell us about that.
Okay, well, there was, Adams, the guy who did our bush hogging, who pulverized the thicket of shrubs, he refused to get off his tractor in any of the meadows because he said the meadows were full of rattlesnakes. I had never seen one. I'd seen a lot of black snakes. I'd seen garter snakes. I'd never seen a rattlesnake. And you know, he showed me the pistol he kept in his front seat in case he saw the rattlesnake. And I was like, okay, that's fine for you. But you know, he kept telling me I needed to get snake-proof boots, which are these, you know, tall boots that have a couple of layers inside. So if the snake bites you, the fangs don't go all the way through. Like, great. I'll get those sometime. And, and still, you know, I would just sort of like feel lucky walking into the meadow going, snake, I'm here, snake. And I didn't encounter a rattlesnake. And then when our house, because we were, I think I may have mentioned, or I may have forgotten to mention, there was no house on this property, despite the fact that we had been looking for a house. There was no well, there was no septic, there was no infrastructure at all, no power. So we had no place to live while a lot of this was going on. But finally, the building was in process. And one day, a basement foundation was in, and there was some framing in. And Bill was walking around on the second floor, which everything was still open. And I decided to go down to the concrete basement. I was walking down the stairs, and I hear this sound. And I was like, Bill, what you doing up there? It sounded like somebody was shaking a box of nails. And so I kept walking down the basement. It happened. He was like, I'm just walking. Okay. I heard it again. And I was like, wait a minute. If he's not making that noise, there's only one other thing that could be making that noise. And I ran up the stairs really fast. Yeah, so there was a rattlesnake in the basement. Yeah.
I go everywhere in my snake straight boots, even when it's probably not necessary in the middle of the winter. But
we have them now. We have the boots
yeah,
now.
yeah,
yes, yes.
Has your mindset changed in any ways? You know, like since you've been out there. I mean, like I have arguments with people about the merits of hunting, the merits of using herbicide, things like that, that you would think as a good environmentalist you wouldn't do, but maybe those sorts of things.
Well, I can say specifically about deer. One of the recommendations that when I talked to a lot of experts so that I could learn what to do with this mountain and to bring back native meadows and so on, and they kept telling me the same thing. You need to control the deer. You need to get rid of the deer. We have tons of deer, and I mean, you see them around here. They're really overpopulated. It's not healthy for them, and because they eat almost exclusively native plants, they decimate the understory in the forest, and they also carry the seeds of invasive plants on their bodies. There are all kinds of problems if you don't have like the right number of deer. So I did eventually have to come around to the idea that hunting was going to be a good idea. And so now we do have controlled hunting on the property. And I even joined this Virginia state organization called a DMAP, which stands for Deer Management Assistance Program, which makes it sound like you're helping them cross the street, right? And really, yeah, it's they track the statistics of the deer that are taken on the property to track the health of the herd and so on.
So you said I joined this organization. I was waiting for NRA.
No.
Like, no, that's taking it a bit far.
I have yet to hunt a deer myself. I have a long history of like looking at deer like they're Bambi. So this was really hard. No, I'm from that. Well, I guess there were several generations of people scarred for life by that movie. so
I've been giving the deer fair warning. The hunting season is like 6 months. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
but
it's long.
If they keep coming up to my house, I'm going to have to shoot them. So doing this, does it make you more optimistic or pessimistic? Like I could see it both ways. You know, you could say the planet is overheating and whatever I do here is just a drop in the bucket. And then there's also the question is, it's so much work for you to fight back these invaders. And, you know, you're at it all the time. So if you look at all the land that's, you know, being lost to this, it almost feels hopeless. So I'd like to get that sense. Is there anything that gives you hope in this? Or is it all about sadness at seeing the destruction.
No, I think it is hopeful. It's inherently hopeful to do something. And a few days ago, there was an American kestrel, which is a small raptor, flying over our meadow. And we just got a couple of nest boxes for kestrels, which they're doing a study in the area because it's a raptor that's in decline. And just seeing that bird fly over was, to me, a hopeful sign that things were going in the right direction. And I do feel like whatever I'm doing on this mountain that's working wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done it. So it's much better to do it than not to do it. I feel a real responsibility, and I'm sort of hopeful as a result of that. I guess that when I do something and something like that bird flying over happens because of something I did, it's very motivating, and it doesn't override the bad stuff that's happening, but it's sort of like a small little way of fighting back, in a sense.
Yeah, I think I share that. Better to light a candle than curse the darkness. What would you say to people, maybe some people here, who's like, well, I've only got a small backyard, or I live in an apartment. It's great that you're doing this, but what can I do in my life?
Well, I think first of all, anyone can do anything, but I think the first step, for me, the first step that was really helpful was just paying attention, because I had a tendency in the suburbs and also when I lived in an apartment to not pay as much attention to the natural world right around me where I lived. I would go travel somewhere to see the interesting natural world somewhere else. But the fact is that the natural world is here, and there are parts of it that we can see anywhere. There's the city park, there's the plants growing in the sidewalk, there's the birds flying over, there are the insects, whether I'm very interested in insects, other people might not be. So I think the first step is just paying attention, and attention leads to curiosity. And when you're curious about something, like I tend to latch onto something and need to know everything about it. And when you're curious about something, I think that can also lead to action. So if you have a window box in your apartment and you plant one native plant in that window box, and say you're into butterflies or say you're interested in birds, go with the thing that grabs you and plant something that will attract what you're interested in. So if you attract butterflies, it's very rewarding to see that you did that. And then maybe in the fall or the winter, if you don't cut those flowers, birds will come and eat the seeds. And that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done that. So you made that happen. And I think the same thing in your yard. Pick one spot. You don't have to get rid of your non-native roses that you love, but pick one spot and plant something native and just wait and see what happens. And I think it can be very rewarding and motivating to see that small change. Start small.
Yeah, and Doug Tallamy, who you wrote about and mentioned in here, says plant a single oak tree, since that seems to be the most beneficial to the greatest number.
Oh, absolutely. So oak trees are host for over 500 species of caterpillars. So especially the white oak.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So they also feed birds, because birds will eat those caterpillars, feed them to their nestlings and so on. And without that, the oak is a keystone species, which means it's a really important species. And without it, a lot of things fall apart.
Let me ask you one more, and then if folks want to get ready to fire off some really, really hard questions, we can do that. What shall we close with? Oh, I know. We were observing when we were talking earlier that I think there's a surprising number of people doing what we're doing. And now I'm sure you are much, much younger than I am, but people of a certain age are doing this sort of thing that we're doing. Do you think it's some generational thing? Is it a midlife crisis? I've been in like a midlife crisis for 20 years, so this is just the latest version of that. But what do you think that, or maybe it's just about, reaching a time when you can do such things, or you have the income to do such things, or what do you think?
Well, I think it is something that I maybe wouldn't have had the bandwidth to do when I was also taking care of kids, working full time. But I do think that there's a second act aspect of it for, maybe for people my age. And I certainly felt like, okay, I have this whole like extra part of my brain now that I don't have to use for this set of like kid logistics anymore. What could I use it for? And I'm always, like I said, I've always been, interested in nature. When I was in grad school for creative writing, I actually did an independent study with the biology department because I was really interested in conservation biology, and I wanted to be able to write more, about science and nature. And so it was sort of like the seed was already planted. Sorry, bad pun. And I think that I just needed a time when here's something. I wanted to go into this part of my life and make a difference. And that sounds so cliched, but if I was going to make a difference, it was definitely going to be something related to ecology.
All right, so we've got a microphone here, and please avail yourself of it. And the usual politics and prose admonition applies to state your speech in the form of a question.
Yeah, I have no speech, so I feel a little guilty for being the first out of the box here. This is a question you may or probably even get a lot, or at least when you discuss things in the general realm of nature conservancy and so forth. What do you use as your guide or definition of natural plants, or animals for that matter, but say for plants? One way to make it easy, I guess, is to adopt someone else's authority on what the species list is or whatever. Another one would be to sort of have your own bespoke list that you think about. And you mentioned some of our 18th century some folks from the 18th century, including George Washington, brought stuff in from afar. Would they pass the test of being on the natural list or not in your case, or just in general? Anything on the realm of what is natural and what isn't? So
That's a great question, and it's something that there is a little bit of debate about.
Right.
But for me, I think if it is not serving the native wildlife wherever it is, then it has to go, or it needs to be contained. So native plants and native wildlife evolve together. They support each other, and they, there are all these native bee species. There's solitary bees. They can only eat one kind of plant, and if that plant disappears, those bees disappear, and so that's the requirement for me, that it has to serve the wildlife. And invasive plants do the opposite. They take up space without serving anything. They have no predators because all their predators are in their native habitat back home, whereas the native plants they're competing with have predators. And the invasive plants have developed all of these ways of reproducing in order to get around the predators at home. But here, that is a great advantage, and they can easily take over and form what's called a monoculture, like a field of just this one plant, and then nothing. I think it's in Wyoming. There's a plant called spotted knapweed that's an attractive flower from Europe, and it has taken over so much territory that elk are starving to death because they can't get enough food to eat. Nothing can eat spotted knapweed here, and so that's the problem.
Yeah.
So
well,
there's...
You've taken the harder path, it seems like, in that you want to think it out rather than adopting an authority that has a species list for you or whatever. in order to do what you're saying, you need to learn something about the ecology of everything you encounter in order to know whether they are providing benefits or the opposite to everything else around.
So there's a
That's the fun part.
Yeah, well, no, I agree. That's great.
there's another category, right? So there's the native plants, and there's the invasive plants, but then there's sort of the naturalized plants that, well, they're not great, but they're not doing any harm. And like Doug, to mention Doug Talamy again, he's like, well, you could think of that. You don't have to get rid of them. You could think of them as like an ornament. But so, what's your view on that? Would you want to treat those or uproot them? Or certainly you probably wouldn't plant them, but would you leave that nice hydrangea?
Well, if you love your hydrangea, there are native hydrangeas.
There are native, but let's suppose it's one of those big, puffy, colorful flowers.
Well, if you love your hydrangea, you can keep your hydrangea. I'm not here to get rid of the plants that you love. I think, on the property that I'm dealing with, there are all these hay grasses. And they form, and the hay grasses, along with the fescues, your lawn grasses, they form a sort of dense mat that prevents the native plants from growing. And that's the problem with the non-native plants when, they're prolific also. And generally, a lot of people don't know this, fescue seeds are actually toxic to sparrows. So sparrows eat a lot of seeds, and it doesn't necessarily kill them, but it makes them sick, and they'll eat them anyway. So the non-native plants are not serving native creatures the way native plants do.
It sounds like you found a number of people who are helpful to you. I'm wondering, I would have this fear that I'd be viewed as the urban carpetbagger. I was wondering how you've been received in the broader community with the project.
That's a great question. I think people are actually really happy that I'm interested in trying to do something good and preserve things on the mountain, as opposed to coming in and building a bunch of houses, or tearing up the land somehow and ruining everyone's view. So it's a community that is. Even if they don't agree on everything, I think they agree about preserving nature. And I had one neighbor who, we have this big 300-year-old oak tree that sits at a high point on one end of the property, and it can be seen from the road below. And one of our neighbors calls it One Tree Hill. And she said she was really happy that, the place that we were interested in maintaining it, because everything that happens on the mountain also travels down the mountain, affects everything else.
Just a quick question. Where you live used to be covered by chestnuts, and they've done a lot of work on chestnuts, and I wondered if you had a point of view of that.
The open area on top of the mountain, well, there was it. The forested slopes are oak hickory forest now. The open meadows on the mountain have been open for many, many years before they were apple orchards. There was a scientist from a place that does experiments with grasslands called Clifton Institute. He came out and looked around at our rock outcroppings and the kinds of plants we were growing, and he said this area was likely savanna for many more years. And it's kind of unusual to have that on top of the mountain. So it may not have been closed canopy forest in this meadow. There would have been lightning-induced fires about every 5 years. They have evidence of that in the soil. So it's a very unusual place. As far as the chestnuts, and the oaks have replaced the chestnuts, I know that. And now, of course, the oaks are threatened by other invasive insects. So, yeah, it's...
So there are some, there are sort of these Frankenstein versions of the chestnut now. So you can get, 7/8 American chestnut with 1/8 of the Chinese, or I think there's one that's now 15/16. I'm debating myself whether take the plunge. Is that close enough? Because it seems like they can survive. Would you do that? I don't. There's all these trade-offs. Like there's also the white ash, which is just about destroyed the way the chestnut was. But if you have one, you can save it with insecticides. So that's another trade-off. What do you think?
I think everything is a trade-off. This is one of the other things I learned about conservation. There's always like the help and the harm, and you're going to help one thing, you might harm another thing, and it's very confusing. The chestnut, I think I'm going to wait because the Bradford pear is too fresh in my mind. The Bradford pear was supposed to be a tree that couldn't reproduce, and it obviously does. It's an invasive tree. It's a problem everywhere. It was planted and it was developed on purpose. It was planted along roads. It drops limbs. It's a terrible, and it smells.
Yeah, but they have the pretty white flowers in the spring.
do.
You see them everywhere around here.
Dogwoods also have pretty flowers.
Yeah, but the ones you're seeing are the pears, unfortunately, for the most part here.
Plum tree, the American plum has pretty white flowers. You can plant that instead.
But if you're not seeing ailanthus on the roadside, you're probably seeing the calorie pears.
Yeah. So I'm going to wait because I'm very cautious about new plants.
I haven't made my decision yet, but I have sort of like a tree graveyard. So I've planted a little ash sapling. They still grow. They grow because the emerald ash borer won't kill it till it's of a certain size. So and I expect I'll treat it as it gets bigger. And for that matter, the chestnuts grow up to a certain size. Still, they just can't. But there's just no way to save them just yet. And then there's the hemlock, which is in trouble. And now somebody tells me the beech is going to be in trouble next.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Laurel wilt or something.
Yeah.
They're coming for everything.
Yeah. I think I would plant more white oaks.
Mm-hmm.
White oaks are in decline, and if you like your bourbon, bourbon can only be aged in white oak barrels. That's the law, or it can't be called bourbon. And so bourbon distributors are actually setting up white oak nurseries. They're actually funding white oak nurseries to help grow more acorns. And it can take 50 years for a white oak to even start producing acorns. So that's how important it is to grow white oaks.
I did not know that. I'm going to look into this. I'm liking both oaks and bourbon. So, anybody else in the crowd here want to jump up? Come on up.
Sorry, my mic's asleep. This is kind of like out of the box and probably like out of the realm of the book, but do you think that climate change will make it harder for the naturalist movement and like private individuals to tame land?
To tame land, is that what you said?
Yeah, to like get invasive species out and
well, it's going to make everything harder. I think it makes it more important, and I think it's also maybe causing a lot more people to commit themselves to this kind of work. So there are two sides to it, I suppose.
Yeah, and the native plants can withstand heat and drought because they're used to that more. So maybe it'll help them.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, the mountain is a very rocky, dry place, and unless you put a lot of nitrogen in the soil, which they probably did when they planted those hay grasses, the native plants will do better in drought conditions. They don't need as much water. The heat doesn't bother them quite as much. So native plants are a good bet.
Kind of coming back to that, I wondered, I think of azaleas and crepe myrtles as like everywhere in DC. I think they're both species from somewhere else. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just curious about that kind of I have a crepe myrtle that builders planted, and my husband and I are in a little bit of a battle as to whether or not it should stay or go, because it now has this little strange white thing that is on its branches, and it's sort of, do we get rid of it or do we try and fix it, which involves chemicals. So I don't know, just kind of that idea of a species that isn't invasive necessarily, but not native to here.
Yeah, I think crepe myrtles are not native. I think there are some native azaleas though.
Okay.
I think, yeah. So you could plant native azaleas. I don't know. If you love the tree, I guess I would save it. And because when you're treating a tree directly, at least it's not, you're not causing problems for other plants around. But maybe there's a way. Are you sure that the insect is an insect on it, or is it like a fungus or something like that? I would try to find out exactly what it is.
It is a little creature, and I've had the landscapers tell me the name of it, and I don't. And it makes you kind of end up with this buildup of black sort of ash, which is their like excrement from the little bugs.
Interesting.
And apparently, it's something that is hitting crepe myrtles more. So
I wonder if it's an invasive insect.
That I don't.
Yeah, see, that's my first question. Yeah. Is it an invasive insect, or is it actually a local insect that's actually become a predator on a non-native tree, which would be strange. Yeah. But yeah, so it's probably safe to spray it, but maybe safer than spraying it, because it could affect other creatures, would be maybe treating the tree internally somehow. Or, yeah.
People have told me to get rid of the crepe myrtle eventually, not a crisis, and plant a service berry instead.
That's a good idea. Or a spice bush.
I have, yeah. So I've done some of that planting, but I haven't. I've got one right in front of my place in D.C., and it would leave a bit of a gap. But when the other trees grow up, then it can go. Have we any others? We got time for another if we've stumped them all. Well, I'm sure you've all bought several books for all your friends and relations, and Paula will be signing them up here. And you've proven you're not a bad naturalist by any stretch. Do you have any parting words before Susan?
Just thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.